Democrats are desperately trying to gain ground in the House this year, while Republicans hope to hold their majority in both chambers of Congress. But as Yahoo senior political correspondent Jon Ward writes, populism is what's popular today, not party. I sat down with him to discuss why party influence is waning and why that may be dangerous for our democracy.
It's really one of the interesting dynamics of politics is that there is this populist anti-establishment sentiment that's really fueled Donald Trump's rise and fueled Bernie Sanders' rise. But if you really do look at the arc and the trajectory of political parties since the late 60s, they've lost most of the power that they had at that time. And parties both at the federal, national level and at the state level are really shells of what they used to be. They control very little. And I think what makes this hard to see is that much of the change has been structural, through rule changes, through campaign finance. And so the architecture has fallen apart, but the impression on the part of the voters that parties still control much of everything as it goes on in politics still remains. And so there is this feedback cycle where for years and years and years, there have been calls for reform to better represent the will of the people. What that's done is that it's made parties weaker, and politics, both at the campaign level and at the governance level, which is really the important thing, has become more chaotic. It's become much more difficult to actually solve problems through government. What does that do? That makes people more upset with the establishment and with government because they want government to fix problems and to solve challenges. And so the more that happens, that actually fuels more anti-establishment sentiment, which leads to more calls for reform, and the cycle kicks back up again.
Well, what about the 2016 election? What role did that election play in the decline of the parties?
I think the biggest thing it did is that it represented the triumph of a candidate, Donald Trump, over a party which at every step of the primary demonstrated a distaste for that candidate. And so Donald Trump won the primary with about a third, with support from about a third of the voters. But it wasn't just a third of the voters. When he went to the convention, a third of the delegates to the convention supported him, and 2/3 did not, because there's a whole process in every state that starts at the precinct level, that goes to the county level, and then to the state level, a process of electing delegates. And it tests a candidate's ability to organize and to persuade and to win over grassroots activists. And 2/3 of those people were for other candidates rather than Trump. So you have the voters, the delegates, and then of course the establishment, the elected officials, party officials did not want Trump. And so he was the choice of only about a third of all of those groups, probably less than that in the establishment. And yet he was able to, through television, through rules that actually favored him in the primary, the winner-take-all, rules that allowed him to win a lot of states or some portion of states with a third of the vote, and through celebrity, really, and through this appeal, constant appeal to the will of the people, he was able to win a primary and basically defeat a party structure that didn't want him.
Because you write about the fact that, in fact, he tapped into his own sort of knowledge of institutions, just not the ones that typical presidential candidates have been accustomed to. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the deeper question of this piece is that it goes back to beyond parties to the word you just mentioned, institutions. And institutions weren't something that I was even really that familiar with or conversant with, I would say, before the last few years. And Trump in particular made me start thinking along these lines as I watched the party unable to actually do what it wanted. And the thing you just mentioned was that Trump was formed by institutions. And the fact of the matter is most of us are. But before Trump, every candidate for president, every nominee had been formed by institutions like politics, state politics, federal politics, law, places that have a lot of grounding in history and in procedure and in the ways of passing laws that are deliberative and procedural. Trump was groomed and formed by institutions largely of entertainment and television and to some degree New York culture and New York real estate. And the values and the norms of those institutions are radically different than the norms and institutions of governance and law and history. And so when you are formed by those institutions rather than the ones that were traditionally shaped candidates for president, you just have a totally different way of doing things. You have a totally different set of expectations. And to some degree that could be good, but I think on a negative level, you don't really understand what it means to be president or how that works. And I don't think we've really seen yet the full extent of what that means for Donald Trump because he's only a year into the presidency.
Well, remind us of the traditional role of parties, political parties in the United States. You write of political parties that they, quote, fill a gap between the realm of what there is to know about politics and what is actually known by voters. What was the original role of the political party in the United States?
Going back beyond the 20th century is something that I'm not even fully familiar with. I mean, I could fill in a few gaps here and there, but obviously at the founding, the Constitution elected senators by state legislature and not by voters. Around the turn of the century, you know, with Teddy Roosevelt, you started to have conventions and some primaries. But it wasn't until the late 60s that primaries started to become important. And what happened in 1968 was that Hubert Humphrey got nominated by the Democrats, even though there was a huge anti-war surge. And in the streets of Chicago, you had anti-war protesters being beaten by Chicago cops who were under the control of Mayor Daley, who ran the Chicago machine. And so that really was a nominee for president, Hubert Humphrey, who did not represent the groundswell of enthusiasm from the base and grassroots of the Democratic Party, who was anti-war, who wanted Eugene McCarthy. So after that debacle, the Democrats changed their rules, made primaries more prevalent, made it more open to voters, all in the name of, you know, making it more democratic. And those are great sentiments, and many of the changes have had good impacts. But even in the 80s, the Democrats saw that there needed to be a balance between popular passions and the wisdom of party veterans. And so what they did is they instituted something called superdelegates, which is now what we're debating in the Democratic Party, and they want to reduce the role of those.
As we look ahead to the 2018 and to 2020 as well, how is this tension between the populist wing and establishment sort of playing out on both sides, not just on the Democratic side, but on the Republican side as well?
Well, President Trump continues to play the populist card a lot. You know, he rails against the media, which is a way of doing this. And I think one thing to keep our eye on is that if Republicans get a drubbing at the midterm elections in the fall, I think you have to be aware that there could be somebody, whether it's John Kasich from Ohio or somebody else, Ben Sass, Senator Sass from Nebraska, who could be asked or pushed or pulled into challenging President Trump in the Republican primary. This may be wishful thinking on the part of some, but there's no doubt that somebody like Kasich is positioning himself for such a scenario. The last time that really happened was in 1980 when Teddy Kennedy ran against Jimmy Carter in the Democratic primary. And what happened to draw Kennedy into that was that a lot of Democratic candidates were really worried about Carter's unpopularity dragging them down. And so when you get party officials, 535 people in Congress worried about their job security, that's when there becomes a lot of pressure on the president to maybe step aside or on somebody to challenge him from within the party. And, so I think the point to your question is that if that happens, Trump would undoubtedly portray it as the establishment trying to get rid of him. It's an open question as to how effective that would be. If his popularity really is low, he might be drawing from a well with not enough water.